Welcome to the Jones Zone, a podcast by Darryl and JJ Jones.
Yeah, you talked about environmental study, and I have a question. Kind of intrigued me, just the logistics of how to do groundwater study. I'm sure how does one test the groundwater?
So these engineering companies test the water, and at all locations, there's a depth where you'll find water. And to give you an example from some of my experiences, it may be 50 feet below the building where there's water underground. And I think the closer you get to the coast versus being inland, say in Arizona versus in California, it may be a lot more boring with a drill that they literally drill down. They take samples of the water at multiple locations around the property, particularly if, let's say, the current tenant or a past tenant all inside the building was in the northeast corner where he had his heavy manufacturing and had solvents and oils. They'll test all around that area going down into the water. Then they take samples and they test it and determine if there's certain metals typically, that are contaminants that over the decades have filtered down into and contaminated the water. That is really a big challenge because remediating the water is difficult. I'll just give you a visual. Let's say a major aerospace company a half a mile to the north of the subject building. It was known that for years and years of building airplanes or airplane engines and all the heavy solvents and manufacturing that goes along with that contaminated the water. And over the years, that water underground flows. It flows to the next door neighbor, the next door, the next door. And if your building is what they call down gradient, it has flowed under your building and contaminated it. So you can't just go down into the water and clean it because there's this constant flowing. You can monitor it and you can minimize the increase of the contamination, but it's super challenging. To the contrary, if under your building there's contamination in the soil, which they test through vapor tests and also testing the soil by the evidence of oils or solvents, what they do is if it's under the building, it's very problematic. But if it's adjacent to the building in the yard, they can go down and excavate the dirt, export it, import clean dirt, put it back, retest it, government signs off on it, lender signs off on it. So it can be challenging if you have a property that has a history of contamination in the neighborhood.
And how much are these inspections? I'm sure it'll vary based on the size of the land, et cetera. But is there a common thought in terms of the cost for these inspections?
So a typical phase one, whether it's a 20,000 foot building or a 200,000 foot building, is probably in the $3,500 to $5,000 range for the inspection. If they identify something, then you have what is called the phase two, where they do more extensive borings, sampling. I've sold buildings where they drilled a half a dozen holes into the concrete to see if the concrete was contaminated. If it was, it lead you to believe the soil below might be contaminated. So they drill into that 6-inch concrete floor. They do other borings that maybe go down into the soil 5 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet. So I can't really speak to the cost of those phase twos, but if I speculated, they might be in the 25,000 range. And then if you find some issues, I've experienced remediation projects that have cost $100,000 to $1 million in that range.
Well, as a layman may think, myself included, why is groundwater seemingly 50 feet or more under the building? Why is that such an important thing to remedy or to know about? Because of it being so far down, how does it affect the building physically? I mean, I know there's reasoning behind it, but what's the fear of what could happen when you have groundwater that's contaminated?
Well, the purpose of all this is the government has regulations, and 50 years ago, the regulations were very loose. You could spray automobiles inside of an industrial building, which was hazardous to the employees and also created hazard to the environment. You could manufacture chrome plate bumpers. And as the years went by, they kept scrutinizing and having restriction on unhealthful uses. For the employee in the building, so you were getting him lung cancer, and also for the environment at large, in the air, smog. Can you imagine in the 1950s, a factory manufacturing black smoke coming out? You don't see that anymore. So these are all regulations to improve the environment. Now, if you go to if you have a heavy use, you might be able to conduct that, let's say, out in the desert on the way to Las Vegas, where there's more open air and there's not population around, versus doing something like that in Irvine or Santa Monica with so many houses and population. It's not going to happen. So they're trying to clean the use, and the contamination that's been created over the years, they're trying to clean it up so that groundwater affects drinking water in that neighborhood. Water that comes in through the faucets in that building. So the whole purpose of this is environmental soundness, clean it up.
And it opens ones up to a lawsuit. Is that also something that's common?
It can be a lawsuit if you buy a building from a seller and the contaminator is usually held accountable for the contamination. So if seller A sells to buyer B and it's not identified or disclosed that there's contamination, and you learn that the ABC wheel manufacturer was in that building for 20 years and created contamination, and now the building that I bought for $10 million, I can't sell it, and it needs $2 million of remediation, I can go approach and reach an agreement with ABC Manufacturing, if that's the name I used, and they'll be liable. And many major corporations, Darryl, are paying for environmental destruction that they did in past years. Openly acknowledge that we created, let's reach a settlement and get that current property owner whole.
Well, that makes sense. All right, let's go to Kent.
By the way, most buildings that are transacted are not affected by these environmental issues, but there are known areas, known geographies where it's more prominent, and typically it relates back to a major manufacturing corporation that had a 1 million square foot facility there. And for decades, they created contamination.
So explain the process of securing financing for commercial real estate. You had mentioned that it's common to have 50% down for a lot of investors, but you also mentioned that there are some that 10% down. That seems a really a pretty low amount down. Walk us through that.
Okay. So there are various borrowers. The high net worth investor I mentioned before, he may want to put a lot of cash down. He's debt adverse. He wants to maximize the cash flow on his property and he's wealthy. But putting 50% or 60% down is a chunk. The process for him is very similar to a residential home sale. You appraise the property, you evaluate the financial integrity of the borrower, and those two things come into play where a lender will be comfortable in making a loan, very comfortable or uncomfortable. And by the way, the borrower's strength and the quality of the building and the city it's in will affect not only the amount of money that will be loaned, but maybe the terms of the loan. As an example, a high net worth borrower that's an investor where the property's appraised at or above the sale price and the borrower's got $100 million net worth and he's got $20 million cash in City National Bank. City National Bank may make him a loan today at 6.25%, whereas the same bank may have another borrower who has a net worth of, let's say, $10 million to pick a round number, and he's got $1 million in the bank after he makes the purchase. And his loan may, instead of being at 6.25, maybe at 6.75. So the credibility of the borrower and the credibility of the product and how it appraises out will affect how good of a loan, or even if you can get a loan. Not too dissimilar from residential. Let's talk about a user, not an investor. Many of the buildings I've sold over the years are to the individual who owns the company that's going to occupy the building. Darryl Jones manufacturing company, Darryl Jones wants to buy the building and put his company in the building. So the SBA, Small Business Association, will make favorable loans to stimulate the small businessman and facilitate him getting a property ownership, building the economy, because that small businessman is hiring employees and the government looks at it like, let's create an incentive. So in the best case, the SBA will make a loan to an individual who occupies the building. Not to get too detailed, you must occupy at least 50% of the building. So if your company, Darryl, required a building of 5,000 feet, you could go buy a 10,000 foot building. Talk to me about it. We go get you an SBA loan, and I'll come back to that. And as part of your thinking, I'm going to be charged by you to find a 5,000 foot tenant to occupy the other half of the building, maybe on a 3-year lease. And your logic is, because I can get high leverage, a 90% loan, I'm going to buy bigger than I need, because then I have a bigger asset appreciating, and my business may need to expand, and I can expand inside my own building. So let's talk about that SBA loan for a moment. You go to your bank, B of A, and B of A makes you a first. They don't want to make you a 90% first. They're conservative. And you're a small businessman with a modest net worth. So instead of making you a 75% loan, maybe they make you a 60% loan on value. And then the government, through the SBA, provides you a second. And again, not to get too detailed, that first is going to be at market rates. For an industrial building today, it's going to be in the high sixes, close to 7, depending upon how credible you are and how this property appraises. And then the SBA is going to make you a second with a more beneficial interest rate. As by example, maybe 5.5%, to incentivize you to be an entrepreneur and buy real estate and help you build your small company. And the government's logic is, if we do this thousands and thousands of times, we're going to help expand the economy and have a source of more employment, versus if we stifle you and you've got to save enough money to put, I know when I bought houses, you could buy them for 10, 20% down. Industrials and commercial, you have to put typically more down than 10, 20. Typical might be a conventional loan, as they call it, not an SBA loan, might be 25, 30% down. So the SBA, the government, has created a means to buy with higher leverage.
You mentioned also lease terms. So you mentioned a 3-year lease. I was just curious myself, what is a more common, for example, residential, it's typically a 1-year lease. So what are the shortest amount of typical leases and what are the longest amounts? Do you do 50-year leases, or how's that look?
So the typical industrial lease is 5 years. Same thing with an office building. Typical 5 years. And typical is 5 years with 1 or 2 options. So it gives the tenant the control to stay there for 15 years and not be moving every 5 years. Some companies are conservative, particularly in these last 3 years where the interest rates have been high. So they don't want to commit for 5 years. They might say, I want a 3-year option with 2 5-year options. That gives them a little more comfort. 1-year leases are done. I'm going to give you a real story that kind of shows the strategy of helping a client and being an unselfish broker. I had a client that gave me a listing on a 90,000-foot building in the South Bay near the ports. And he wanted me to lease the building for 10 years. He said, I want a good long-term tenant, and then I don't have to worry about this. And in 10 years, I'll give this property to my 2 boys, because they're now young 20s, and they'll be mature businessmen. And then they'll do smart things with this property. So we go out in the market about a year ago, this story started, and the economy is challenged. There's negative absorption, which I mentioned before. More people bringing properties to market than square footage wise, is how they measure absorption, than is being leased. So the market's challenging, and he kept asking me, do you think you're going to succeed for me? I know you're conscientious and good, but you're operating in challenging times. I said, yes, we'll be creative, we'll be proactive, we'll approach industries that are doing well in this tough economy. He asked me, what are those industries? So one of them I named was food and beverage. I said, in a recession, restaurant business can go down a bit, but consumer buying eggs, milk, meat, that stays stable. So anyway, I went out and I found somebody in the food and beverage business, interest in the building. They wanted a 10-year lease. They were a 75-year-old company, and my client was delighted. Oh boy. Michael Collins is going to pull a rabbit out of the hat and lease my building at a tough market. While we're negotiating with this company, they had many asks we want you to resurface the warehouse floor because we're in the food business and there can't be a crack in that floor where anything can interfere with our food products. I go out and get a bid to resurface a 90,000 foot warehouse. I won't get into it too deep. We're a food manufacturer. Your power panel has 800 amps of power, 800 amps. Quite good. We're a food manufacturer. We have lines of manufacturing equipment. We need 2,000 amps. My client says, well, I'll provide it to them, but what does that cost? I said, there's two things involved. One is the cost, and one is the time to get the Edison company to facilitate upgrading the power. So we had the floor for hundreds of thousands of dollars. We had upgrading the power for a couple $100,000. And then they said to us, when we kind of reached an agreement on term, 10 years, rate, what they would pay per month, they said, you know, there's a lot of options for us out there. One of the buildings we looked at, the owner told us he'd give us 6 months of free rent. 6 months of free rent. So we pay rent for 9.5 years, but while we're getting set up, putting our equipment in, we're not paying any rent. We like that. So if we lease your building, we want 6 months of free rent. And I basically told them, we're not going to give you 6 months of free rent. I understand it's available down there, but that building doesn't have all the amenities we have, including the things we've offered to provide you. So I put in writing what we would do, and recollection was, we said something like, we'll give you 3 months of free rent at the beginning of the lease, and then we'll give you a month of free rent after year 1 in month 13, and we'll give you another month of free rent after 2 years, month 25. And my client liked that because he said, I don't have to wait so long to collect my first rent check. But we gave him 4 or 5 months, but it was a little staggered. About this time, when my client is ready to sign the lease, I found a warehouser that said, I'll lease the building. And it was mid-month, like as we're speaking, starting on the 1st. I don't want anything done to the building, but I won't pay you the rent this long-term tenant will pay you. I want a bargain because I have a lot of choices. So I said, how long of a lease do you want? He said, 3 years. I said, would you take 2 years if the lease rate was compelling? He said, yes. So I went to my client and said, you can have this mega company, international food company, 10 years, but you got to spend $500,000 fixturizing. And you've got to give him $750,000 of free rent. Or you can have this tenant who will pay you $50,000 less in rent. Let's say the big food company was $150,000 a month, and this warehouser was $100,000 a month. And he said, well, why would I do that? No upfront costs. We lease it to him for 2 years, and we come back in the market, in foreseeably an improving market, because interest rates are falling. And there's pent-up demand from people who have been cautious. And it's my belief that the industrial market, it went up over the decades, up, little dips here and there, went down during the last few years. And I see it's flattened and turning up. Flattened by more absorption, rents that fell down have kind of bottomed and are turning up. So I said, let's make a 2-year lease. And in a year from now, we'll assess the market. And if it's strong, or 18 months from now, and it's strong, we'll go into the market. I'll have a half a year while you're collecting rent to find a very good tenant. And the upfront costs for this deal are substantially less. He said, I like the idea, and we signed the lease, and within 2 weeks, the tenant moved in and was paying rent. Now, looking back a year, many of the competing buildings in his neighborhood, he asked me, is that building still on the market? Yes. Is that one? Yes. He said, I'm so thankful you talked me into doing that. And he said, I imagine your commission on a 2-year lease with the rent at $100,000 was dramatically less than on a 10-year lease at $150,000. And I said, well, one lease transaction was valued around $2.4 million. The other was valued around $15 million. So the answer is yes, but that was the right thing for you. So you asked the question, and I told you a long story, but typical 5 years, there's an example for 2 years and the logic behind it. And often with a tenant like Home Depot would sign a 10-year lease with 5 10-year options, but the norm is 5 years.
Other than negotiating the deal, Michael, is there really much else that a broker can do, a commercial real estate broker?
To me, it's critical that you're a good negotiator and you're aware of the market alternatives and values. That way, if in any given region there's 24 buildings available, you can assess the quality of the buildings, the lease rates or sale prices, and then come to a comparative evaluation as to what is the best value or what are the better values that are suitable for the requirement. And then the skill to negotiate. In my company, we have 150 salesmen and 10 offices, 9 in Southern California, 1 in Phoenix, Arizona. And the income that these 150 men and women make is a very dramatic difference. The top 20 or top 50 versus the bottom 50, they make 10, 20 times as much money. And I, as a leader in the company, evaluate that. And they're likable, they're problem solvers, but they're great negotiators. And not grinding, trying to take advantage of the other side, just creativity. Like the example I gave you earlier, we want 6 months of free rent. In a pleasant way, no, but we'll give you 5, but not all up front. And it has the same economic value, essentially, to you, and you're a wealthy company. But once you negotiate the deal and deal with the lease document or the escrow, and the deal's complete, I would say that a fair number of brokers kind of move on to the next deal. I think there's still an equal amount of work to be done. Although most of my business is sales, I just leased a building in Huntington Beach. Lease is all signed as of last week. There's tenant improvements that we promised the tenant will do. Paint the exterior of the building, trim all the trees around the building, refurbish the landscaping, remove a couple of significant walls to open up the warehouse, recarpet the office, repaint the office, modernize the lighting fixtures. So the owner owns a few dozen buildings. He's got relationship with contractors. I'm moving on. I'm not moving on. I've already taken contractors through the building that I've worked with over the years that I trust, that are suitable for this effort, which is small tenant improvements versus something very dramatic where I might go to a major contractor to do something, expand the building. remove part of the building and build new panels and add 10 truck doors. So I take the contractor through. I get a bid from him to me. I review the bid. I tell him, let's not do this. I'm going to go have the office carpeting done independently by a carpet company I've done work with in the past. You do numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but 6 and 7, I'll have somebody else do it. I want to make it easy for my client. I go to my client, tell him, and while we're going through the negotiating process, he asked me, what it will cost me to do those things? Okay, I'll do that. And maybe I'll give him a bid or a budget between 20 and 25,000. Then I'll go get it done professionally, hopefully for 18,000. I'll oversee it. It'll get done. When it's done, I'll tell him to pay the contract. He never has to get out of his jammies in Beverly Hills. But that's a continuing effort. Environmental. Client is going to buy a building. I'll buy it. It's a good deal. I'm going to pay cash. So let's go. Well, wait a minute. Let's have it at phase 1. Well, who should we hire? Tell me about the phase 1. So over the years, I've watched many different tradespeople, from architects to builders to tenant improvement contractors to environmental engineers. And when you're the, quote, lowly broker around these people, they're not trying to impress you. They're cordial to you because you're a source of business. But I get to read them. Oh, we'll quote this guy $25,000 to do that effort, make ourselves 10 grand. I'll hear that. He's not getting a bid. And from doing it for a long time, I have a sense of these costs. And I've developed a go-to architect, a couple of go-to contractors I trust implicitly. And because I bring them opportunity, when I call them, they pay attention, they go meet my client, I make an introduction. And so there's many services the broker can provide that are indirect, time consuming, build the trust, build the relationship. And I sincerely want my clients to be happy, and I want to take care of them so I can endorse every step we're taking.
So, Michael, what advice would you give someone looking to break into the commercial real estate industry as a real estate agent?
Commercial real estate is very challenging and difficult. And I explained to my friends and my family that you can progress a transaction along, but you only get paid when it's closed. So you can go out and meet somebody that has a requirement. They want to lease a 50,000-foot industrial building, and they like you and they work with you. But then one of their friends at the country club says, oh, I know a great broker and you should talk to him. And this happens, and I'm not offended when it happens. And I'm showing them 2, 3 buildings, and now the country club friend is taking him out to dinner and they become best of friends. They go to a Rams game and he's showing them buildings. And we make an offer on a building, one of mine that I've submitted to him. And we negotiate, and then maybe he gets cold feet because he's assessing how much the rent is, or maybe the drive time from his home is he's stretched a little bit. So we'll pass on that. Let's keep looking for something near me. So the process is time consuming. I would say the average time to make a commercial transaction is 6 months from the beginning. That's a long time to be working for free. Now, the veterans that have been at it, they are working on a deal for 6 months, but they've got 6 deals that they started 2 years ago, 6 months ago, 4 months ago, so they can have some consistency of income. You asked the question, what would my advice be for somebody younger or new to the industry? First, you have to recognize what you're dealing with. You see brokers with nice cars or a nice home or out on the golf course. It doesn't come easy. And the early years can be very, very tough. So you have to be prepared for the fight. You have to pay your dues. I think you have to be disciplined. You have to be willing to earn the money and not be looking for a quick, oh, if I sell a building for $10 million and the commission's 5%, I'd make $500,000. Well, it doesn't work that way. The $10 million building, which I may have listed, and I have two of my colleagues join me, a young protege that helps me on my deals, and an expert in the city of Huntington Beach, in my last example. There's now three of us representing the landlord, and then the tenant comes, or the seller, and then the tenant comes along, or the buyer comes along through his broker. So we negotiate a $10 million deal, and it ends up at $9.25 million. And the seller says, you know, I've rolled up my sleeves. I want you brokers. You're going to be paid handsomely, 4%, not 5%. And on $9 million, now instead of 500,000 is 360. Each side gets 180. And my trio each gets credit for 60,000. And then my company takes, rightfully so, a portion of that. So where it looks like 500,000, it may be 35, 40,000. So you need to go through the math with your mentor and understand the realities of doing this. And I used a $10 million deal as an example, not a $1 million deal. So you have to understand the challenges. You have to assess yourself. Am I good at math? Am I disciplined? Can I take rejection? Do I have good people skills? Am I willing to learn the market before I go out and try to lease or sell somebody something? It can be very rewarding, but it takes time. You know, on the residential side, there are a lot of people that want to come into it and feel like, well, I'll sell my relative's house. But the experts take a geography, they learn the market, they take college courses, or they already have a degree in accounting or marketing, and that will help them. I think it's very important to work for a good company, and more importantly, to work with a good mentor. A good mentor can make or break a person. I've seen mentors that are very sharp, that make very good money, that live a nice lifestyle, and they'll have their young colleague go get their dry cleaning or drive me to the country club an hour away and drop me off. One of the things I try to do with the people I train and guide is to treat them like they've already made it. So I would never have them drive me to the country club, but I would have them join me to play golf at the country club and get exposed to some wealthy, successful developers, brokers, so they want to be part of that. Treat them like they're experts. Trust them.
So I think we've covered a lot of there's three questions left. What about retail spaces? How does that differ from industrial properties or office buildings?
All of these properties, retail, office, industrial, which again, you now see is more of my expertise, they're owned by investors that willingly and chose to invest in those product types. And they all have different aspects. So since we've spoken a lot about industrial, let's talk about retail and office. So over the years, the office building was the crown jewel of corporate investors. The Prudential insurance companies that takes their premium excess, they invest in office buildings. Prudential Insurance owns office buildings in LA, New York, Houston. Office investment is prestigious. You've probably heard in New York, the Sears Tower. These buildings are named after major corporations that invest. The Metropolitan Center, that's Metropolitan Life Insurance. So office buildings have prestige. Office buildings are often, if not always, in the most prime areas of a community because they need to be with nearby high-quality residential, retail amenities. Office buildings are beautiful inside. The space is lit, it's clean, a janitor comes in every day. So it's a quality product. The challenges of office are that the prestige and ego of mega millionaires and billionaires has caused development to build a taller building, a better building, and reasonably so with the thought, let's say you're in New York City and Donald Trump wants to build the Trump Tower. His logic is it's going to have a gold exterior. The lobby's going to be the finest lobby. And I'm going to attract all the law firms and CPA firms who are very successful to come out of their 30-year-old, very nice office building into the best, newest office tower. And over the decades, that has worked to some extent. And owners of office building had high returns and generally high occupancy. 85, 90% over the years. The pandemic has crushed that dream because the economy in general went down after the pandemic. Interest rates went up. And moreover, for the office product, people learned, I can work 2 days a week from home. I can work full-time with home. Now, not all employers allow that because in a business like yours and mine, interaction, synergism, motivation is critical. But if somebody's at home that is a technician and he can operate through computers and get his work done, then he doesn't need to come to the office. So overall, I think businesses downside by a good percentage, and that shrunk the occupancy in the office market. Earlier, I said the office vacancy in Southern California is reported to be around 17.5%. I don't believe it. I don't think the owners of office buildings, when the surveyors come along, honestly indicate what the real vacancies are today. I'll bet it's closer to 30%. And in some communities, 50%. The office market has been really hurt. So would I sell somebody an office building today? Yes. Would I sell them an office building at a 6% return? No. If somebody came to me and they were very wealthy and they didn't want to buy a cookie cutter investment, industrial, one tenant, 5% return, that didn't make their blood run. They want to make a killing. They were a self-made man or woman, and over the years, they've grinded their way in their young 60s to wealth. I'd say, you know what? When everybody's going north, I like going south. Let's go buy an office building. Let's buy an office building in downtown LA that is 60% occupied, and the owner is going to lose the building to the lender because 60% occupancy isn't paying all the bills to air condition that building, janitors, all the employees to operate that, and his mortgage, if he has one, which most do. And if that office building was once worth $500 a square foot, what if we could buy it for $125 a foot? Well, he's not going to sell it for $125. Some will. Some lenders may take it back and say, we don't want to operate that office building. And when the new law firm comes in to lease a floor at discounted rent, we got to give them $100 a square foot in tenant improvements. That's $2 million and 20,000 feet for a floor. We don't want to go through that. So they can't even underwrite how it makes sense. So the owner gives up, as they say, gives the keys to the lender. The lender doesn't want it. So maybe there is and you ride a new cycle when your basis is so low. And by the way, to build that office building, that one I'm envisioning, like the one I'm in, it's not going to be this one. This is such the prime Orange County building, the prime location next to the Sagerstrom Center. But if there's 100 high-rise buildings in downtown LA and a lot of space available, and you can buy one for $150, and at that low basis, you can project a 9% return after refurbishment, new TIs, and with the low base, you can beat the guy down the street who paid $400 for his building. Retail vacancy is surprisingly lower than I thought it would be instinctively. I would have guessed it would be double industrial and half of office, but it's as low or maybe even lower. So risk is down because there's high occupancy of retail. Retail, I'm starting with the pros and I'll give you the cons, like I did with office. Retail spread risk. You have a retail strip center that you own, and maybe you also own the one building where Big Five is in it, or Best Buy. So you have a big anchor tenant that's a draw for the other support tenants, and you got 10 of them and you lose 1, 2, 3 tenants, you're okay. You will lose 1, 2, 3 law firms in an office building that each have 1, 2, 3 floors. That's a stab in the heart. But you lose Betty's Beauty Shop or Johnny's Burgers, you're still okay. You're still paying your mortgage. And over time, you bump the rents by the standard 3% annual increase to keep pace with inflation, and your net income is going up annually. Not so bad. The downside for me of retail and why I do industrial is you're dealing with, not always, but generally less sophisticated tenants. You maybe experience somebody that slow pays you, and then 6 months later they go broke and you got to release. There's a lot of hands-on management with the retail. Retail yields, though, are better than industrial. To me, yield is a reflection of the overall investment. You buy a prime apartment complex in Irvine, California, that's 5 years old, that's at 100% occupancy. The cap rate or yield is going to be less than a 45-year-old apartment complex in Yorba Linda with 80% occupancy. Yield is a reflection of all the components, the quality, the age, the occupancy, the quality of the tenant. Now in residential, the quality of the tenant is mixed, but the quality of tenant in a Beverly Hills apartment complex is much higher than in an apartment complex in Stanton, just by nature of the per capita average income in that region. So I have sold office investments. I recently sold an office retail complex in Ventura. I've sold dozens and dozens of industrial. I grew up as an industrial broker leasing, so I know and understand the components. And when I got into investments, I came to learn the things that have served industrial investors well. In this pandemic and decline, the values have gone down, but they're still double, triple what they were 10 years ago. And so are the rents. So if I gave you a graph with my hand, in 1950, industrial real estate was with this, and it's gone like this. And it's gone down, but now it's starting to turn again. But if you've owned for 30 years, you're golden. If you own 2 industrial buildings that you bought in 2000, just 2, and they're not huge, you've made millions of dollars in appreciation. And when the tenant goes out with 5% vacancy, the probability to release is it'll happen within 6 months, not my office building, which is we've got a 5-year plan to get whole again.
Michael, thank you so much for giving your insight. You're clearly an expert in your field of what you do, and we really appreciate that. If there's anybody that would like to get a hold of you, what would be the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Well, my company is Dom Commercial. We're headquartered in downtown LA. If you Google Dom Commercial, you can see our various offices. You can find me. I'm officed in our investment capital markets office, which is in Orange County, Costa Mesa, 650 Town Center Drive, ground floor. Gorgeous office for all of us here. My phone number is 714-345-1014. Anybody can call me that wants a job, got a question about their building, or maybe has $50 million and want me to sell them 3 investments.
That sounds great. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into the Jones Zone. I hope you learned something. I certainly did. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. And Michael, thank you again. Have a great rest of your year. Take care now.
All right. All the best, Darryl. Thank you.